Chapter 8. Political Consciousness and International Unity. It has already been a running undercurrent in this book that the class struggle between capitalist and proletarian is international in character and therefore requires the proletariat to organize as a class internationally. The point surfaced in Chapter 1 in the form of Marx and Engels' criticism of the Gotha unification. It reappeared in Chapter 2. The commitment of the coalitionist right in the Second International to managing the capitalist nation-state involved them in the logic of attacks on the working class for the sake of national competitiveness. And Chapter 3, the Trotsky Center's national horizons ultimately led it to support feeding the European working class into the mincing machine of World War I. The question of internationalism as an element of working class strategy was also critical in understanding the split in the Second International. In the subsequent chapters, fighting for unity of the workers as an international class unavoidably involved splitting with the coalitionist right, which placed and places loyalty to the nation-state before loyalty to the working class. The Comintern characterized the Second International's collapse in the face of 1914 as resulting from, in part, its failure to organize real international unity, and proposed as an alternative a much more tightly centralized and disciplined international. Yet the Comintern was dissolved in 1943, leaving behind the looser common form of communist parties which, like the socialist parties, were fundamentally nationalist in their strategic horizons. The Trotskyists founded their Fourth International in 1936 as a world party of socialist revolution, something in theory even more centralized than the Comintern. In 1953, this world party broke up into two competing organizations: the International Secretariat of the Fourth International, ISFI, the predecessor of today's Mandalite Fourth International, and the International Committee of the Fourth International, ICFI. The European core of the ISFI has remained relatively stable as an international organization. The same cannot be said for its politics. The current Mandalite FI has become unequivocally an organization like the Second International. That is, it is a loose coordination of national parties, in this case mostly grouplets, whose leaders meet periodically and pass diplomatic resolutions. The ICFI tradition has given rise to a bewildering range of internationals, Heliite and sub-Heliite variants, Lambertiste and sub-Lambertiste, Laurista and sub-Laurista, Morinista and sub-Morinista, Spartacist and sub-Spartacist, and so on. Almost all of these internationals are the international fan clubs of national organizations in the main historic centers of Trotskyism: France, the US, Britain, and Argentina. Meanwhile, Trotskyist organizations that were originally purely national in character, such as the French Lutte Ouvrière, the British Militant, both Grantite and Taffite wings, and the British Socialist Workers' Party and Workers' Power, have created their own internationals or international tendencies. This plethora of international sects has had the effect among broad layers of activists of discrediting the entire idea of an organized workers' international political movement. Internationalism has, as a result, become reduced to two elements. The first is effort to promote and/or reform the United Nations and the international rule of law. Whatever their intentions, these actually serve to give political support to the global, US-led capitalist system of nations. The second is fundamentally liberal international solidarity campaigns around hotspots in global politics, based on moral hatred of suffering and injustice, rather than on a positive strategy for international action of the working class. These campaigns do some useful work, but lead nowhere and rarely reach deeply into the working class. To the extent that there is a strategy involved in anti-imperialist internationalism of this sort, it is the Maoist, third worldist idea of surrounding the cities, that is, that revolution in the colonial world can overthrow the imperialist world order. The present character of the Chinese and Vietnamese regimes, and all the other formerly radical third worldist regimes, all too clearly shows the falsity of this strategy. Around the year 2000, there appeared to be a small glimmer of hope for a renewed broad international movement in the anti-globalization movement and the world social forums. But the bureaucracies of the major national parties and unions and the NGOs supporting this movement have combined with the dominance of anarchistic, movementist ideas in the ranks to produce a series of, no doubt interesting, periodic talking shops. The direct action alternative in the anti-globalization movement largely represents merely an opportunity for some youth to have a Barney with the police. After the first media shocks of the 1990s, this has had about as much practical political effect as if the same militants were to expend the same energy fighting the police after football matches. The root of this catastrophe is that the Second, Third, and Fourth Internationals shared a common false conception of the role of the international action of the working class in revolutionary strategy, and that the Third and Fourth superimposed on this error a particular variant of the Comintern's Bonapartist centralism, the idea of the general staff of world revolution. The result has been to produce international sects on the one hand, and a reaction away from proletarian internationalism and international organization in negative dialectical response to the international sects. The Communist League that issued the Communist Manifesto was a small group, mainly composed of migrants, together with some supporters among Paris artisans and a section of the left wing of the British Chartist movement. Communists of various nationalities have assembled in London and sketched the following manifesto, to be published in the English, French, German, Italian, Flemish, and Danish languages. The migrant core of the League, and Marx's and Engels' combination of German philosophy, French socialism, and English political economy, reflected the international character of the larger democratic movement of which this was part. The voice of this tendency was to be amplified by the 1848 revolution in Germany, albeit the actual Communist League did not survive the defeat of this revolution. This revolution, in turn, was part of a European revolutionary wave extending from France to Hungary, which from beginning to end took place within the space of a couple years. The First International was launched on the back of the campaigns of British radicals and the workers' movement in 1862 to 63, to prevent Britain intervening on the side of the slave owner Confederacy in the American Civil War. The immediate moment of its launch, in 1864, was an appeal by London trade union leaders to Paris workers' leaders for joint action in support of the Polish struggle for independence. Its activity consisted of a combination of international strike support, both financial and through urging secondary action, with political interventions against national oppression, Poland, Ireland, and against threats of war. The Second International was prepared by attempts in the early 1880s to unite European socialists, but took its real impetus as a movement from the Chicago Haymarket Massacre of 1884, and the consequent struggle for May Day as an international workers' festival. The International was formally founded in 1889 and made the struggle for May Day a symbolic center of its work. An international of symbols. The Second International remained until 1900 merely a series of socialist congresses that passed resolutions, without a leading body equivalent to the General Council of the First International, which could respond rapidly to events or organize strike solidarity. In 1900, the International Socialist Bureau was established. The online catalog of the archives held in Amsterdam by the International Institute of Social History suggests, although the IISH's holdings may very well be defective, that the ISB was proportionally considerably less active than the General Council of the First International had been. The First International had been an international of practical tasks. The Second International was, starting with May Day, mainly one of symbols. Why? The fundamental explanation is that its leaders thought the struggle for workers' power was one conducted within the boundaries of single countries. Following Marx and Engels, that the proletariat of each country must, of course, first of all settle matters with its own bourgeoisie. Communist Manifesto. Not clear how far Marx and Engels still believed this in their later lives. After all, the 1864 inaugural address of the First International had asserted that past experience has shown how disregard of that bond of brotherhood which ought to exist between the workmen of different countries and incite them to stand firmly by each other in all their struggles for emancipation will be chastised by the common discomfiture of their incoherent efforts. And Engels, in his 1875 letter to Babel, criticizing the Gotha program, had commented that the German party should be conscious of its solidarity with the workers of all other countries and will, as before, always be ready to meet the obligations that solidarity entails. Such obligations, even if one does not definitely proclaim or regard oneself as part of the international, consist, for example, in aid, abstention from blacklegging during strikes, making sure that the party organs keep German workers informed of the movement abroad, agitation against impending or incipient dynastic wars, and, during such wars, an attitude such as was exemplarily maintained in 1870 and 1871, etc. However, after the split with the Bakuninists, Marx and Engels had supported the move away from maintaining the international as such in favor of building national parties that organize working-class political action at a national level. The logic of this policy was, as we have already seen, to place the major emphasis on the growth and strength of these national parties, ultimately, if necessary, implying the pursuance of a revolutionary defensist policy in war. Marx and Engels did not much discuss the relation between the national revolutions supposed by the claim that the proletariat of each country must, of course, first of all settle matters with its own bourgeoisie, and the international character of the workers' movement posed by the Communist League and the First International. Nor did Marx, in his critique of the Gotha program, draw out the strategic implications of his comment that the framework of the present-day national state, for instance the German Empire, is itself, in its turn, economically within the framework of the world market, politically within the framework of the system of states. Every businessman knows that German trade is at the same time foreign trade, and the greatness of Herr Bismarck consists, to be sure, precisely in his pursuing a kind of international policy. It is commonly said that generals tend to plan to fight the last war. 1848 was an international revolutionary wave in which more or less simultaneous national upsurges were obviously part of a common international movement. Marx and Engels fairly clearly saw this experience of their youth as a model for the future revolutionary movement. It did not appear. Instead, the period was dominated by a series of national movements and short European wars. The Crimea in 1854-56, the Franco-Austrian War in 1859, and unification of Italy in 1860, the Austro-Prussian War, 1866, and the Franco-Prussian War, 1870, which led to the Paris Commune. The defeat of the Commune in 1871, the split in the International with the Bakuninists in 1872, and the defeat of the Spanish Revolution in 1873 shifted at least Engels' thinking towards what was to become Trotskyism, the patient work of building up the organized forces of the working class, carried on mainly through national politics. In the parties of the Second International, this evolved into a clear conception that the working class could take power in individual countries as the conditions in these countries became ripe for socialism. The logic of this evolution was to be most fully brought out in Trotsky's Preparations for Peace, October 1914. Democracy can only find its best expression in a state which consists of one nation, speaking one language. Modern production brings the people ever into closer touch with each other. The more the inner divisions fall away, the more all the members of the state speak the same language. The more intensively can economic, intellectual, and political life proceed. And within this method of production is arising the cooperation of the lower classes' intellectual and political life, which means additional strength to every nation. In a national state, both these tendencies combine and strengthen one another. In a state of various nationalities, they come into hostile collusion with each other and have a paralyzing effect on the economic and political process, all the stronger as development progresses. The nation-state is here made not only the present, which the workers' movement has to face, but also the necessary future of humanity. We have already seen the underlying problem with this approach. Capitalism is from the beginning an international social formation, and the nation-state is, in relation to the world market, merely a firm. The state firm retains liquidity by borrowing on financial markets. These, if they are national in form, are international in substance. This was already true of the 17th century Amsterdam and 18th century London financial markets, An attempt in a single country to break with capitalist rule, or even to significantly improve the position of the working class, will thus be met with withdrawal of credit by the capitalists, leading to an immediate crisis of state liquidity and more general economic dislocation. If a socialist government responds by expropriations, the immediate effect is to break the incentive structure of the capitalist market in the country and increase economic dislocation. In addition, the response of international capital will then take the form of blockade and war. It thus becomes immediately necessary to move the generalized planning under economic autarky. This was the situation of the Bolsheviks in 1819-19. It has been repeated with varying results, usually the collapse of the socialist government, many times since. The result is, in fact, as it was in the former Tsarist Empire, economic regression. Hence, the Socialist Party loses its majority support and is forced, if it is to continue its course, to minority dictatorship and increasingly systematic repression. In countries that are not self-sufficient in food, energy, and raw materials, that is, most advanced capitalist countries, the result would be mass starvation. The socialist government would collapse into a capitalist government far more rapidly than happened in Russia and China. Exception that proves the rule is the outcome of World War II, the effects of which stretched down to the 1980s. The deep global crisis of British world hegemony, culminating in World War II, and the particular form which that war took, yielded the result that the USSR was massively strengthened while remaining under bureaucratic rule. In the ensuing Cold War, there could appear to be a series of national revolutions, but in reality, these were possible because the countries involved, most clearly Cuba, were brought into and subsidized by the autarkic bureaucratic planning system of the Soviet regime. Equally, the US, now hegemonic over the capitalist countries, consciously encouraged social democratic and nationalist reform in capital's frontline states as an instrument to secure them from being added to the Soviet Empire, part of the policy of containment. The offensive of the working class in the late 1960s and early 1970s destroyed the policy of containment and led the US to turn to a global policy of aggressive rollback of communism under the banner of human rights. The fall of the USSR has finally destroyed the foundations of the policy of concessions for the sake of containment. The exception is now over. It still proves the rule because it was international events and dynamics, World War II and the Cold War, enabled the supposedly national revolutions and reforms. Capitalism is an international system, and it is international events and movements that enable radical change in individual nation-states. Of symbolic unity. The Second International offered mainly symbolic unity of the international workers' movement. But this symbolic unity was profoundly important to the development of workers' parties in the individual countries. The point is clearest at the fringes. In Britain and the US, May Day became, in the 1890s, the focus of the early stages of development of class political consciousness after the later 19th century slough of pure trade unionism, and in the early 20th century the connection to the Second International pushed the more advanced trade unionists towards politics, and the socialist groups towards unity. Similarly, relations to the international movement pushed the French, Italian, and Russian socialist groups toward unity in a single party, actively encouraged by the Trotskyist leadership, at a level that the divided socialist groups could not. There are no doubt other examples. In fact, the same is true in Germany itself. In 1875, Liebknecht wrote a Lassallean program for Gotha, perhaps imagining that this was necessary to achieve unity. In reality, the Lassallean General Association of German Workers was desperate for unity and would have accepted it on any terms. It had been losing ground to the Marxist Eisenachers, because of its hostility to broad trade unions, its dictatorial internal regime, and the Eisenachers' clear opposition to the imperial state, which had been expressed by their MPs' refusal to vote for war credits in 1870. The Eisenachers' roughly democratic character, support for trade unions, and internationalism were all legacies of the First International. The working class is an international class. It can only attain full political consciousness of its character as a class, become a class for itself, if this character is expressed in international unity of the workers' class movement. The symbolic unity offered by the Second International was less than was needed for the proletariat to take power, but still necessary for the proletariat to get as far as it got in the run-up to 1914. We can see the same phenomenon in the fate of the Communist and Trotskyist parties and groups after the dissolution of the Comintern. The allegiance of the tankies to the USSR and its leadership was a deformed and bastardized internationalism, but it was a form of internationalism nonetheless. The Eurocommunists, as they lost their internationalism, also lost their ability to promote any sort of class politics and became, if anything, more liberal than the Social Democrats. Among the Trotskyists, in the split of 1953, the Pabloite ISFI prioritized the unity of the international movement, while the anti-Pabloite ICFI prioritized the organizational independence of their national parties. The result was that the ISFI and its successors remained more open and democratic than the successors of the ICFI, which universally wound up creating Stalinist internal regimes and common forms around their national parties. As the ISFI's successors in the 1980s began to theorize the idea that only the sovereign national parties, not the international, should act as parties, they also moved more generally towards Eurocommunist non-class politics. Even in distorted forms then, the struggle for international unity of the working class and the struggle for working class political independence stand and fall together. Question. If the policy of the Second International was fundamentally one of separate national revolutions, there was an undercurrent that suggested a repeat of 1848. This was expressed in Marx and Engels' responses to the Russian Narodnaya Volya, and became current among Russian Marxists, most explicitly in Trotsky's Results and Prospects, but also in Lenin's Two Tactics. The idea was that the fall of the Tsarist regime would rapidly trigger a European-wide workers' revolution, an 1848 on a higher level. This was a view held by Marx and Engels at the time of the Crimean War, and the correspondence with the Narodniks and Russian prefaces to the manifesto revived it. It was, in fact, a reasonable but mistaken response to the defeat of 1848. Russian intervention had played an important part in 1848, in defeats in Poland and Hungary, and the Tsarist regime was one of the principal guarantors of the European regime of the Congress of Vienna and the Holy Alliance that backed it. Knocking Russia out of the picture should, therefore, let loose the national democratic movements in Central Europe, Poland, Hungary, etc. This would bring down the Austro-Hungarian and German regimes, and trigger European-wide revolutionary aspirations in the style of 1848. It was a mistake because 1815 was fundamentally a British-sponsored settlement, placing a pressure lid on continental politics for the benefit of Britain. True, the Tsar, the King of Prussia, and the Emperor of Austria had provided most of the soldiers to defeat France, but the money that funded their armies had been raised and mobilized through London at the behest of the British government. The 1847 economic crisis led to the British-imposed lid being blown off all across Europe in a revolutionary explosion. The primary change that ensued, the regime of Louis Napoleon in France, freed French capital from the British-imposed chains of 1815, so that the French state could begin to compete on the military international level with Britain. As a result, in the ensuing period, Germany and Italy were driven towards unification in order to emulate France, and governments began to use, or return to using, war and imperialism as a means to bleed off the internal contradictions of domestic politics and economics. Hence, after the Crimean War, the idea that the Tsarist regime in any strong sense guaranteed European political stability or was the policeman of Europe was illusory. In 1914 to 18, the point was emphatically demonstrated. Far from the Russian Revolution triggering the European Revolution, the European War triggered the Russian Revolution. The Central European national movements then proved to be a bulwark, first of German, then of Entente, policy against the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution did, at one remove, trigger revolutionary movements in Hungary, Germany, and Italy. It did so not by the route envisioned by Marx and Engels, that the removal of fear of Russian intervention in Central Europe would open the way to a revolutionary movement, which would spill westwards. Nor did it do so by the route projected by Trotsky in Results and Prospects, that the Russian Revolution would spill over into Germany and/or trigger a collapse of the London and Paris financial markets. Rather, the perception of the revolution as a workers' revolution triggered an international radicalization of the workers' movement. This radicalization reached its highest points in the countries which could not see themselves as victors in the war: Germany, Austria-Hungary, and, in a slightly different way, Italy. Advanced workers in these countries saw a possibility of workers' revolution as a result of 1917. They could see this possibility because of the prior symbolic international unity of the workers' movement in the form of the pre-war Second International. At first, October 1917 seemed to show that the working class could take power. This image promoted revolutionary attempts elsewhere, but the impulse rapidly ebbed. As disturbing news began to filter west, even Luxembourg in prison was hesitant. As the character of the Soviet regime was rendered more explicit in the theses of 1920 and 1921 Comintern congresses, the ban on factions and the Kronstadt events, the majority of the existing militant left activists of the workers' movement in Western Europe took their distance from the Bolsheviks. This was reflected in the 1921 splits from the Comintern of both the larger part of those among the left of the Kautskian center who had flirted with it, and the left communists, larger than they later became. These splits foreshadowed the future. The nature of the Soviet regime was to become a primary political obstacle to any attempt of the working class to take power into its own hands in Western Europe, and ultimately to international class political consciousness more generally. The image of an international chain of national revolutions, starting with Russia, was nonetheless to be the governing idea of Comintern international strategy, and after it that of the Trotskyists. Comintern and the Trotskyists. The idea that became the Communist International began, as we have already seen in Chapter 4, with the anti-war wing of the Second International, and with Lenin and Zinoviev's struggle within this left for an international split. Comintern was able to emerge because of the Bolshevik seizure of power in October 1917, and the survival of the revolutionary regime into 1919, when the first Congress of Comintern met. The result was that Comintern had a double character. On the one hand, it was an international of the anti-war left, attempting to redeem the honor of socialism after the ignominious political collapse of the Second International. On the other, it was a fan club for the Russian Revolution and its leaders. The fan club aspect became more prominent with the defeat of the Hungarian and especially the German and Italian revolutionary movements. On the one hand, the Russians had the prestige of victory and the material resources of state power. On the other, the Germans had lost some of their most eminent leaders, and the Westerners in general had failed where the Russians had succeeded. It was natural for Comintern in these circumstances to become a body that propagated the idea of the Russian Revolution as a universal model. In international strategy, this had two aspects. The first was that defense of the Soviet regime was the central touchstone of the Communist Party's internationalism. The idea that it might be appropriate to admit the defeat of a proletarian socialist policy in the face of the defeat of the Western revolutionary movements of 1919 to 20 and of peasant resistance in Russia, and carry out a controlled retreat to capitalism was literally unthinkable to Comintern. Whether such a retreat was a possible option is doubtful, but the inability of the Communist parties to think it probably contributed to the fact that the degeneration of the Soviet regime into open tyranny brought the Communist parties down with it. It also produced among the Trotskyists a bizarre body of competing theological dogmas about the Stalinist regime that provided ideology for the Trotskyists' endless splits. Back to separate national revolutions. The second aspect was a political retreat to the idea of a series of discrete national revolutions. This was a retreat in the first place because, as we saw in Chapter 4, Lenin and Zinoviev's policy of dual defeatism supposed a struggle by an organized international movement to bring down the belligerent states simultaneously. It was a retreat, secondly, because it was quite clear to the Russian leadership that the proletariat could not hope to hold power in Russia for long. How long was uncertain, unless the Western workers' movement came to their aid. October 1917 was thus a gamble on the German Revolution. By 1919, with German social democracy in the saddle, the gamble had failed. It was only gradually that the possibility of hanging on and waiting for the Germans for a year or two was transmuted into the idea of a prolonged period of isolation of the Soviet regime, and from there into socialism in one country. In the third place, Comintern at the outset and down to 1921 expected a generalized European civil war in the short term, and in the civil war in Russia and the 1920 invasion of Poland, the Russian Communist Party had been willing to ride roughshod over national self-determination to carry the arms of the Red Army to the borders of the former Tsarist Empire. In 1920, they hoped to carry them to the eastern border of Germany, ready to intervene if the German communists could provide the casus belli. Only military defeat held them back there, and in Finland and the Baltic. By 1921, this policy was effectively over. This fact was signaled both by the retreat in Russia, represented by the new economic policy, and the turn to the struggle to win the masses urged on the Communist parties at the Third Congress. Do what the Russians did. The shift into a policy of separate national revolutions, even if these might turn out to be close together in time, carried with it an increased emphasis on copying the Russian Revolution. The struggle for Soviets, intervention in the bourgeois parliaments, the struggle to win the trade unions, the worker-farmer alliance, Bolshevizing the organizational norms of communist parties, the United Front, the workers' government, the policy of the right of the self-determination of nations, and what became transitional demands. All these were justified primarily on the basis that they were validated by the victory of the Russian Revolution, and only secondarily and sketchily on more general theoretical grounds. There was only one example of a successful revolution, Russia, and socialists everywhere had to copy it. If it were not for the immediate context of defeat in Hungary, Germany, and Italy, and the general belief that revolutionary crisis and civil war were on the agenda in the immediate term in the West, this claim would have been utterly extraordinary. Russia was a country in which the proletariat was a small minority. Communications in the Russian countryside were highly patchy, and in many areas the technology in use in agriculture and the density of market towns was more comparable to the West European 12th century than to the 16th, let alone the early 20th. Trade unions and political parties alike had existed in Russia before the revolution illegally on a small scale. The German Reichstag had limited powers, but looked more or less like a French or Italian Chamber of Deputies. The Russian Duma was far more limited. There was little reason to suppose that the tactics that had brought down the fragile and not very democratic regime of the 1917 provisional governments and the shallowly rooted cadet, Menshevik, and social revolutionary parties would work on the far more deeply entrenched and experienced political parties of Western Europe, the US, or even Latin America. Imitating the Russians was not utterly disastrous, in the same way attempts to imitate the Maoists in more developed countries were in the 1960s and 1970s. This is attributable to the fact that most of what the Russians endeavored to teach the Comintern in 1920-23 was in fact orthodox Trotskyism, which the Russians had learned from the German SPD. But there were exceptions. The worker-peasant alliance was utterly meaningless in the politics of the Western Communist parties before 1940, and after 1945 was a force for conservatism, as the European bourgeoisies turned to subsidizing agriculture. The Bolshevization of the Communist parties, and the savage polemics against Trotsky and others over classless democracy, became part of the common inheritance of official communism, Maoism, and Trotskyism, deeply deformed these movements. In the end, the Bonapartist centralized dictatorship of the party bureaucracy produced kleptocrats in the USSR and the countries that copied it. In the Western Communist parties and the trade unions associated with them, it produced ordinary labor bureaucrats with more power to quash dissent than the old socialist bureaucracy had deployed, a feature gratefully copied by the social democratic right. In the Trotskyist and Maoist groups, it produced petty patriarchs and tin-pot dictators whose interests in holding on to their jobs and petty power were an effective obstacle to unity. It thus turned out to be in the interests of the capitalist class. Moreover, casting out the renegade Trotsky cut off the communists from the Western European roots of their politics. Lenin and his co-thinkers' transmission of the inheritance of the Second International into Russian politics became Lenin's unique genius on the party question, feeding into the cult of the personality of Lenin and its successors. Perfectly ordinary Western socialist political divisions, pre-existing the split in the Second International, had to be cast in Russian terms. Communists began to speak a language alien to their broader audiences, the language that has descended into today's Trotspeak. General Staff of World Revolution. Trotsky described Comintern as the political general staff of the world revolution, and the phrase to some extent stuck. The idea of a general staff was, in fact, taken from the German Imperial Armed Forces. The Prussian Grosser Generalstab had been the first such institution, and the imperial version had conducted the strategic planning that was put into effect in 1914. It carried with it a very centralized concept of command. The imperial general staff, to a considerable extent, micromanaged the particular fronts. In the latter part of World War I, the imperial general staff headed by Hindenburg and Ludendorff became the effective government of Germany. This background in Prussian military thought carried with it a willingness in Comintern's leadership to micromanage the national parties. At the very beginning of the Comintern, the Russians pressed their closest German co-thinkers for an early split with the Independent Social Democratic Party, USPD, a decision the German leaders regretted. The ECCI had no hesitation in issuing instructions to the French Communist Party, PCF, about, for example, the composition of its leadership and the reorganization of its Seine Federation, and pressed the German Communist Party, KPD, in 1923 to make military preparations for an insurrection. So far this point is familiar from the Euro-communists and their followers' attacks on Comintern and on Trotskyism. It is important, however, to be clear that the general staff of world revolution was not simply wrong. If it had been the case that Europe was on the verge of generalized civil war, the creation of a European-wide military command structure capable of giving orders to the national movements would have been entirely justified. In war that is to go beyond guerrilla harassment of the enemy to take and hold territory, it is necessary to have a centralized command. It is also sometimes necessary for units to sacrifice themselves in diversionary attacks that will enable victory elsewhere, or, for that matter, in attacks that will lead to breakthroughs by attrition. It might thus have been justified to wager the KPD on the possibility that a breakthrough in Germany would bring down the whole European state system. Trotsky certainly went on thinking so for the rest of his life, blaming the KPD leadership for fumbling the crises of 1923. There were two underlying problems. The first is that war is the continuation of politics by other means. Clausewitz. War is not reducible to politics, nor politics to war. Creating a top-down military command structure in the Russian Communist Party, Comintern, and the other communist parties tended to eliminate or subordinate the local and sectoral mediations that link a workers' party to its broader working-class constituency, and feed back on the center the political ideas and mood current in this constituency. It thus reduced both the communist parties and the Comintern's ability to form the political judgments that necessarily underlie decisions for military action. Second, the communists were nowhere near having political majority support in Europe or even in Germany. The task of the communists once the revolutionary wave of 1919-20 had ebbed was, as Comintern recognized at the Third and Fourth Congresses, to win a political majority. It was not to launch a civil war. A general staff of world revolution was therefore inappropriate. The military centralist character of Comintern had the practical effect of making the leaderships of the communist parties dependent on the Comintern center in Moscow. This took the form of material dependence in the case of the small communist parties, such as the CPGB, which received subsidies from Moscow, and equally in those parties that were illegal, so that the party leadership was located in Moscow. But it was equally present in the stronger communist parties such as the KPD and PCF. The democratic centralist character of Comintern, within the terms of the 1920-21 idea of democratic centralism, had the effect that the leaders of these parties were answerable to and removable by the Comintern center. They could not both be in this position and be answerable to and removable by their own membership. The problem was accentuated by the fact that the relation to the Comintern center in Moscow was necessarily clandestine. In the first place, if the KPD or the CPGB openly took orders from Moscow, prosecution could follow. All the more if, as in Germany in 1923, the orders were to prepare for and launch an insurrection. Second, because it was based in Moscow, The Comintern Center lacked the sort of legitimacy that had been possessed by the General Council of the First International, or by the Congresses of the Second. It was all too easy to accuse it of being merely an instrument of the Russian state. Clandestinity meant secrecy, and secrecy meant that the members had even less chance of holding the leaders to account than would have been the case if there had been open and transparent subordination of the leaderships of the communist parties to the International Center. There was no chance in this regime of the Western Communist parties resisting the development of open bureaucratic tyranny in the USSR and the accompanying degeneration of Comintern. In 1919-20, there was a West European bureau of the Comintern based in Amsterdam. It turned out that the left communists had a majority, and their split brought it to an end. The bureau was overlapped with and was succeeded by an equally short-lived Western European secretariat, based in Berlin, involving at least Radek and Levy. A Central European secretariat was slightly more long-lasting. The short life of these organizations reflected the fact that the military or Bonapartist character of the centralism of 1921 was counterposed to them. Horizontal connections between neighboring parties and sub-centers would inevitably compromise the pure centralism of the International. There were to be the national parties and the International Center. This structural form reinforced the idea of separate national revolutions. Formal horizontal collaboration might identify concrete common political features or common tasks. The same would be true of intermediary levels of organization, such as European or, by analogy, Latin American or Pan-African conferences and leading committees. Within national parties, such intermediary structures are common, although bureaucratic centralism tends to close them down or turn them into mere transmission belts for the center. Channeling everything through Moscow had the effect, in contrast, that there could only be national tasks and global tasks were defined by the view from Moscow. Trotsky's call for the Fourth International. This background character of Comintern helps to explain the peculiar character of Trotsky's decision in 1933 to denounce it as dead for the purposes of world revolution and call for a new Fourth International. The peculiarity of this decision is the fact that Trotsky denounced the Third International on the basis of events in a single country, Germany. The First International had been founded on the explicit basis of the international tasks of the proletariat as a class. The second, more indefinitely, on the basis of the international, common character of the proletariat's interests and struggles. The third, at least formally, had been founded on the failure of the second in World War I. To denounce the Comintern and call for a new international on the basis of a defeat in a single country was therefore something quite new. Even if the country, Germany, had been the historical center of the Second International and home to one of the strongest communist parties. Trotsky seems to have imagined that the Comintern would be defined forever by the disaster in Germany, as the Second International was defined forever by August 1914. The choice to support the existing states in war indeed did turn out to be a permanent choice that defines labor right and socialist parties to this day. 1933 was not comparable to August 1914. By 1935, the Comintern had abandoned the sectarian third period politics that led to the disaster of 1933 and turned to the People's Front policy. In spite of a brief return to the third period during the Hitler-Stalin Pact in 1939-41, the People's Front was to be the main strategic line of official communism permanently, and still is today. The third period and its role in the disaster in Germany has become a matter of interest to historians and Trotskyists. The 1933 call for a Fourth International was therefore plainly premature. It was only with the People's Front turn, as the communists more and more plainly abandoned both working-class political independence and criticism of the Social Democrats, that the Trotskyist project began to win broader support. Even then, the growth was limited. The Fourth International, founded in 1938, could account for about 7,500 organized militants worldwide. Part of the explanation for Trotsky's premature call for the Fourth International is that, as can be seen from his writings in the 1930s, He had become fully convinced that Lenin was right and he was wrong between 1903 and 1917. He was therefore determined not to do anything that could amount to conciliationism or postponing the necessary struggle to create a new party and a new international. Cominternism. There is, however, another and in some ways more fundamental aspect. Trotsky's conception both of the International Left Opposition, ILO, formed in 1930, and of the projected Fourth International, was that they were to be a revival and continuation of the Comintern of 1919 to 23. The documents of the first four congresses of the Comintern were part of the ILO's platform and of its successors, the International Communist League. This unavoidably meant that the ILO, ICL, and Fourth International carried in their roots the ideas of a chain of national revolutions, starting now perhaps somewhere other than in Russia, and of an international whose tasks were mainly to create parties of the Bolshevik type in every country. On the one hand, this meant that defeats and disasters in single countries formed the real basis of the critique of the Comintern, and of the critique of those such as the Spanish POUM and French PSOP, with whom the Trotskyists broke on the road to the Fourth International. On the other, the idea of tasks of the International as such in constructing international unity of the working class in action had no strategic ground in the Trotskyist ideas. A tiny group, of course, could do little practical along these lines, but the Fourth International was bound to appear as a micro-miniature Comintern with a leftist version of Comintern strategy. The Fourth International also inherited from the Third the utter centrality of the defense of the Russian Revolution and hence of the USSR in wars with capitalist states to its identity and program. 1939 to 40, this position was to split it down the middle over the Russo-Finnish War and the Soviet occupation of eastern Poland, with Trotsky insisting that the minority in the US and elsewhere should not have the right to express its views in public. The minority took a third of the membership of the US Socialist Workers' Party, the largest group represented at the 1938 Congress, and half of the International Executive Committee elected at that Congress. Bureaucratic centralism. The refusal to accept public factions in 1940 was in contradiction with the Trotskyists' own history. The Trotskyist movement had originated in the 1920s as an illegal public faction of the Russian Communist Party, and the ILO, launched in 1930, had been an illegal public faction of Comintern. The Russian oppositions, indeed, had had as part of their core politics a critique of bureaucratism, albeit one that was cautious and imperfectly articulate. Part of this critique survived in the culture Trotsky sought to create in the ILO and ICL. The 1933 resolution, the International Left Opposition, its tasks and methods, said that the foundation of party democracy is timely and complete information, available to all members of the organization and covering all the important questions of their life and struggle. Discipline can be built up only on a conscious assimilation of the policies of the organization by all of its members, and on confidence in the leadership. Such confidence can be won only gradually, in the course of common struggle and reciprocal influence. The frequent practical objections, based on the loss of time in abiding by democratic methods, amount to short-sighted opportunism. The education and consolidation of the organization is a most important task. Neither time nor effort should be spared for its fulfillment. Moreover, party democracy, as the only conceivable guarantee against unprincipled conflicts and unmotivated splits, in the last analysis does not increase the overhead costs of development, but reduces them. Only through constant and conscientious adherence to the methods of democracy can the leadership undertake important steps on its own responsibility in truly emergency cases without provoking disorganization or dissatisfaction. These statements are a standing rebuke to the post-war Trotskyists. The aspirations of the 1933 resolution were at least partly reflected in the conduct of the international secretariats of the ILO and ICL and in Trotsky's correspondence. Secretariats were willing to accept partial splits and public fights in the sections, and Trotsky urged the creation of horizontal relations between the sections, that is, that their debate should be carried into the other sections, as well as vertical section-secretariat relations. However, Trotsky's response to the 1939-40 minority that rejected Soviet defensism was bureaucratic centralist, and it drew on the idea of splits as purging and proletarianizing the movement that had been initiated in the split in the Second International, as we saw in Chapter 5. Trotsky was assassinated in 1940. His writings on the U.S. 1939-40 split thus left, as his last legacy to the post-war Trotskyist, bureaucratic centralism and the idea of the proletarianizing and purging split. 2, 3, many internationals. In the world between the opening of the Cold War in 1948 and the beginning of the open political crisis of the USSR in the 1980s, official communism appeared to be a strategic way forward for the global working class, and apolitical trade unionism and social democratic coalitionism appeared to be a strategic way forward for the working class in the imperialist countries. Although Comintern had been wound up in 1943, the official communists had a form of international, the common form. The CPSU had discovered that a consultative international secured freedom from accountability as effectively as an open bureaucratic dictatorship, and with fewer overhead costs. The situation posed to the Trotskyists the question, what was their international for? In 1953, they split between the majority Pabloite advocates of a tactic of large-scale fraction work in the Communist parties and their anti-Pabloite opponents, who insisted on building parties organizationally separate from the official communists among the milieu of the French socialists, British Bevonites, and Rooseveltian Democrat trade unionists. The split was characterized by bureaucratic centralism on both sides. As first the International Executive Committee expelled the majority of the French section, and then the US SWP and British section expelled minorities in their organizations that supported the Pabloite international majority. The minority formed an international committee, but turned out to be unable to produce anything more than occasional liaison meetings between the French, British, and US full-timers. In due course, the national components went their separate ways, with the usual round of expulsions. Each created an openly bureaucratic centralist Comintern, or formally consultative Trotten form, with its own party in the role of the CPSU. This was the legacy of Comintern's chain of revolutions idea, and the leading role in Comintern of the most advanced party, with the American, British, and French each imagining that they were the most advanced. The Pabloites, after 1960, the Mandelites, did a little better. They preserved the forms of an international organization with center, leadership, international congresses, and press, and a degree of internal democracy in their organization. In the early 1970s, they even began to develop continental perspectives and centers, and horizontal relations between sections. But if you asked them what their international was for, the only answer they could give was to be a center where the international experiences of the mass movement and of the revolution are progressively assimilated. At the end of the day, this is to say no more than the Fourth International must exist because it must. Their international had become the Mandelite sectarian shibboleth, which distinguished them from their Trotskyist competitors in individual countries. The insistence of the Mandelites that no one could be a Trotskyist without the Fourth International pressed the national groups, even quite large ones such as the French Lutte Ouvrière, British Militant, and SWP, to create their own. The 1953 split, and, all the more, the 1971 split between the British and French anti-Pabloites, had the effect of legitimizing multiple internationals among Trotskyists. At this point we have arrived at today's world of Trotskyist sect internationals, although the full Baroque elaboration was not to arrive until the 1980s. The Trotten forms are, like the common form, just as much creatures of bureaucratic centralism as Comintern and the Fourth International in its most centralist period. For example, the British SWP's international socialist tendency is not formally democratic centralist, that is, bureaucratic centralist, but this tendency can nonetheless expel the U.S. International Socialist Organization for supporting a minority faction in Greece in 2003. Fight for an international. The need for an international is posed because the working class has concrete, immediate, practical international tasks. These are tasks of class solidarity, because the bourgeoisie uses national divisions in the working class to defeat strikes, etc. They are also tasks of formulating an independent class perspective on world affairs. These were the lessons of the First International. The need for an international is also posed because the working class can only really understand its own strength and become conscious of itself as a class for itself by becoming conscious of itself as an international class. This was the lesson of the symbolic role of the Second International. In the third place, the need for an international is posed because the working class cannot take power in a single country and wait for the proletariat of other countries to come to its aid. This is the fundamental lesson of the degeneration and collapse of Comintern and the eventual fall of the socialist countries. It was a lesson that was not learned by the Trotskyists. The strategic task that this lesson poses for an international is an internationally united struggle of the working class for political power. It should be apparent that the objective political conditions do not yet exist for such a struggle, but they do exist for continental united struggles for political power, which fight for continental unification, a communist party of Europe, a pan-African communist party, and so on. A dynamic towards the continental unification of politics is already visible in bourgeois politics, not just in Europe and in the Latin America Chavista Bolivarians. It is even present in an utterly deformed and reactionary manner in the Islamist movement in the Middle East. Comintern was not sterilized by the decision to split from the Social Democrats. It was sterilized by bureaucratic centralism, the idea of a chain of national revolutions, and the idea of Comintern as a fan club for the Russians. Its failure was about the inability of Comintern to think of international tasks, except either as immediate civil war, which called for a general staff, or making the national communist parties copy the Russians as the road to victory in a single country. The Trotskyist 1933 call for a new international was premature, but it was not this premature split that turned their project into a swarm of malignant international sects. Rather, it was their too great faithfulness to the ideas of the early Comintern, which committed them to the same bureaucratic centralism and the same idea of a chain of national revolutions. This in turn produced the anti-Pabloite Trotinterns and Trotinforms on the one hand, and the Mandelite empty form of an international without political tasks on the other. The struggle for an international is a present, concrete task of communists. It is clear, however, that the struggle cannot be carried on by creating yet another micro-international. It has to be carried on by fighting, on every occasion that allows, against bureaucratic centralism and the nationalism that goes hand in hand with it, and for the concrete tasks of an international. The global struggle for solidarity and the immediate class struggle, for the symbolic unity of the working class as an international class, and the continental struggle for working class political unification and political power.